What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFB Kings Show. Hope you're all having a great start to this summer. We are just about 80 days away from the 2024 season, and just about 40 or so days away from the release of the College Football 25 video game. There's been a ton of stuff coming out about that game lately. They just released the gameplay trailer last Friday, and I've been posting a lot about it. So if you're interested in staying up to date with it and all things college football, really, make sure to go follow CFB Kings on Twitter and Instagram. The CFB 25 video game will be releasing in July, and it's going to give us a nice boost for the offseason and make the last little bit of it go by pretty quickly. So let's get right into today's episode, though. For today, I wanted to start moving the show's content toward previewing the 2024 season and some of the teams that I think could have a major role in it. Yesterday, ESPN released the first edition of the 2024 College Football FPI, and I made a couple posts about it on Twitter and Instagram about some of the preliminary percentages given by the FPI for teams to make the college football playoff and for teams to go undefeated this fall. The FPI usually confuses a lot of people and doesn't always make sense, but sometimes the computer and algorithm do produce some pretty viable projections. If you don't know, the FPI is Football Power Index, and it's basically a power rating of all 134 FBS teams based on a number of different factors like offense, defense, and special teams, obviously, but returning starters on offense and defense. If your starting quarterback is returning, it puts some emphasis on that. It has a built-in input on the team's head coach and what they've previously done. It factors in transfers and recruiting classes, all of that stuff. And when it was released yesterday, the FPI gave the Notre Dame Fighting Irish the best chance of any team to go undefeated in 2024. It gave Notre Dame a 15.8% chance to finish 12-0, with the teams closely behind them in percentage being Oregon, Georgia, and Ohio State. At first, like most people probably were when they saw it yesterday, or if you're just hearing it for the first time now, I was pretty surprised to see Notre Dame there until I remembered a pretty critical detail about their 2024 schedule. And I saw this a few weeks ago and found it pretty insane and wanted to share it today because I think it'll definitely help more people see why there's a real possibility that Notre Dame could actually go undefeated this fall and be in the college football playoff. Of course, they can't ever be in the top 4 of the college football playoff because they need that conference title auto bid in order to be one of the top 4 and get a bye week. But I find that kind of ridiculous, but it's a conversation for later. So the thing about Notre Dame's schedule this fall that could seriously have them in contention to go unbeaten is that they play just 3 games in an opponent's stadium. To reiterate, they play just 3 of their 12 games in a true road environment where the other team has a home game and host them in their home stadium 3 times in the entire 2024 season. And what's even crazier is that those games are in week 1, 3, and 12. So between weeks 4 and 11, I mean, they don't go into a true road environment at all. And week 1, they go to College Station to face Texas A&M and Kyle Field, where College Game Day has already announced that they'll be going for week 1's show. And then Notre Dame goes to Purdue in week 3. So their 8 of their final 9 games of the regular season are either at home or at a neutral site, with week 12 being at USC. Then, should they actually go undefeated, since they can't be in the top 4 without the conference title auto bid, like I said earlier, they would likely be number 5 or maybe number 6 by default as a 12-0 team, which is crazy. But that would result in them hosting a first-round playoff game under the new 12-team expanded format. So there's a serious chance that Notre Dame could play 10 different games where they don't go to an opponent's stadium this year before the neutral site CFP quarterfinals, semifinals, or national championship. I mean, 10 different games in which they're not going to be in an opponent's stadium is crazy. How is that possible? You're probably wondering. Well, they have 3 different neutral site games. They play Georgia Tech in Atlanta, but at Mercedes-Benz Stadium instead of at Bobby Dodd. They play Navy in the Giants Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey, and they play Army in the Yankees Stadium in New York as part of the Shamrock Series. So the Georgia Tech one isn't necessarily a big deal. I mean, Mercedes-Benz is like a 6-minute drive from Bobby Dodd, but just not playing in a team's home stadium does make a difference. I mean, there's a different routine involved. There's a different sort of feel to it for Georgia Tech players. I think they choose to have one of their home games played at Mercedes-Benz every year, but this is the one for 2024, which benefits Notre Dame. So not a huge deal there. I mean, it is quite literally like 6 minutes down the road, but yeah, definitely. I mean, it could throw things off just not having that home environment a little bit for Georgia Tech. And then East Rutherford, New Jersey isn't terribly far from Annapolis, Maryland, but still obviously not a home game for Navy. And then Army going from West Point to the Bronx is a little bit of a drive, but not terrible. So it's not a major factor for these neutral site games, but none of them are actually in home environments. That does decrease attendance slightly for fans that don't want to travel. Not like I said, not a big deal for Georgia Tech, but for the other two, could affect some fans not wanting to go as far, students not wanting to go as far, all that sort of stuff. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see their schedule on the screen, but if you're listening on podcast, they go at Texas A&M, home against Northern Illinois, at Purdue, home against Miami of Ohio, home against Louisville, home against Stanford, neutral site against Georgia Tech, neutral site against Navy, home against Florida State, home against Virginia, neutral site against Army, and then at USC. So their schedule isn't really one of the hardest to begin with. They have the 55th toughest strength of schedule according to the ESPN FPI. Then they have just 3 of their 12 games in true road environments, one of which being USC, and not to knock the program or anything, but it's just not very full in the Coliseum most of the time. It's just an unfortunate fact, and I do hope that they get that environment back like they had back in the day, but lately it just hasn't been all that intimidating to go into. But then their 2 toughest games of the season, as of what we know now about teams in the preseason, are at Texas A&M on August 31st, and then hosting Florida State on November 9th. They usually play, I think it's 5 ACC teams every year. This season, those ACC teams are Louisville, Stanford, Georgia Tech, Florida State, and Virginia. So, yes, Stanford is an ACC opponent for Notre Dame this fall as part of all the realignment that happened last summer. Cal and SMU are also now in the ACC as well. So Notre Dame doesn't have to play Clemson, who beat them last year. They don't play Miami, who beat them by 33 the last time they played. They don't play NC State. They don't play North Carolina. And overall, they got a pretty favorable draw as far as ACC teams go. Florida State obviously being the toughest of them, but Louisville could pose a threat as they were last season. Louisville actually beat Notre Dame, I think, by 13 last year, but then Stanford, Georgia Tech, and Virginia. Georgia Tech's getting better, but Stanford and Virginia, it could be pretty rough in those games for them. And the point that I was making earlier about Texas A&M and Florida State, those 2 games, are that they get several weeks to prepare for the Aggies, with it being their first game, obviously. They can spend as much time as they need in fall camp strategizing for how they're going to approach going to Kyle Field and taking on the Aggies. And that will also be Mike Elko's first game as the head coach of Texas A&M. And then they get one of their 2 bye weeks before they host Florida State. And while they get that bye week, Florida State will be at the end of a 4-game stretch where they go at Duke, at Miami, and then host North Carolina before going at Notre Dame. So the Irish will be rested before Florida State comes to town, and the Noles will be playing their 3rd road game in 4 weeks, which is wild. Notre Dame plays 3 true road games the whole year, and Florida State plays 3 true road games between October 18th and November 9th. So moving on from the schedule to Notre Dame's actual team for this season, the Irish had the number 10 recruiting class in the 2024 cycle, bringing in notable recruits like 5-star defensive lineman Bryce Young, a different Bryce Young, who was the number 1 player in North Carolina. They brought in 4-star quarterback CJ Carr, who was the number 1 player in Michigan. He'll be sitting behind Duke transfer quarterback Riley Leonard, who Notre Dame also brought in to replace Sam Hartman. Leonard accounted for 1,238 total yards and 7 total touchdowns in the 5 real games that he was the starter for the Blue Devils last season until he suffered a broken ankle. And he did come back later for 2 more games. I think one of them was against Florida State, but it just wasn't the same after he hurt his ankle, and those first 5 games really give an accurate depiction of what he can bring for Notre Dame this fall. So 1,238 total yards and 7 total touchdowns. Those 5 games included a victory over Clemson, in which Leonard had 273 total yards and a touchdown, and then, ironically, very nearly a victory over Notre Dame as well. The Irish converted a 4th and 16 against Duke to survive and beat them late last season. But should Leonard, and we hope not, but if he does get hurt again, the Irish have a solid backup option in CJ Carr. Other recruits that they added were 4-star linebacker Kingston Viliamu Asa, I believe is how you say his last name, 4-star wide receiver Cam Williams, 4-star offensive tackle Gerby Lambert, 4-star running back Kedron Young, 4-star safety Bronte Johnson, 4-star edge Logan Thomas, 4-star wide receiver Micah Gilbert, and 4-star wide receiver Logan Saldate. So they also brought in Clemson transfer wide receiver Bo Collins, who had 91 receptions for 1,290 receiving yards and 11 touchdowns in 3 years with the Tigers, averaging 14.2 yards per catch. And then they added FIU transfer wide receiver Chris Mitchell, who had 64 receptions for 1,118 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns for the Panthers last season, averaging 17.5 yards per catch. So they definitely improved in the wide receiver core. They had several transfer departures, but got 3 4-star wide receivers, a 4-star transfer, and actually 2 4-star transfers in Collins and Mitchell, I believe. So that's 5 4-star wide receivers that they brought in that weren't on the team last year. And then they also added 4-star Duke transfer RJ Oben, who's a edge, but he's going into his 6th year of college football. He had 6 tackles for loss and 5 sacks for the Blue Devils last season, continuing that Duke to Notre Dame pipeline that has seemed to develop. But they also added Tyler Buckner. If that name rings any bells, he's had quite the journey over the past few years. Buckner was Notre Dame's backup quarterback 2 years ago, and then came in late in the season to lead the Irish to a Gator Bowl victory over South Carolina, in which he accounted for 333 total yards and 5 total touchdowns. He then transferred to Alabama last season, where he sat behind Jalen Milroe, and then left Alabama after the playoff game and decided to leave football altogether, transferring back to Notre Dame, but this time to join the lacrosse team, where he actually just won the national championship, I think last week in lacrosse, and has now decided to rejoin the Notre Dame football team, but as a wide receiver. So he's had a very busy couple years, but who knows, maybe he can provide something at receiver for Notre Dame this fall. And they returned starting tight end Mitchell Evans, who accounted for 29 receptions for 422 yards and a touchdown last season. He's projected to be one of the first tight ends taken off the board in next year's NFL draft. On defense, they return an elite safety in Xavier Watts, who had 52 total tackles, 4 pass deflections, 1 fumble recovery, and 7 interceptions last season, one of which was a pick 6. Head coach Marcus Freeman is going into his 3rd full season as a head coach for the Irish. Two full seasons to look back at, learn from, and approach this 2024 season with. They ended last season with some momentum. They won 5 of their last 6 games, with the lone loss coming on the road at Clemson by 8. But outside of that, they beat USC by 28. They beat Pitt by 51. They beat Wake Forest by 38. They beat Stanford by 33. And then beat a pretty depleted Oregon State team, but by 32 in their bowl game. They finished AP number 14 last year and look to pick up right where they left off in 2024. But Notre Dame, 15.8% chance to go undefeated this fall, the highest of any team in college football, and it's not as far-fetched as most people may think. So that's about all that I had for this episode. Like I said toward the beginning, the show's content is going to be pretty much focused on the 2024 season from here on out, and previewing different teams, schedules, matchups, non-conference games, making predictions, and really just doing my best to provide insight into the upcoming season of the sport that we all love. So if you have any recommendations, if you want your team previewed, if you want me to go through any sort of team that you're just curious about, make sure to leave a comment below. I always look at all those and make sure to take into account your input, and really appreciate it. So that's going to wrap it up. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, or follow wherever you're listening on podcast, and come back next time for some more college football content. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.